Alright guys, well here is the TBL day video. Now we're covering the autonomic nervous system. As I mentioned before, we were going to come back to the nervous system after already transitioning out of it, and so we're doing that now. So we're going to get into the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so if you remember the hierarchy of the nervous system, obviously spent a lot of time last semester here with the CNS, some last semester and this semester here, the peripheral nervous system, spent some time with the sensory, with the special senses and touch and temperature and all those senses this semester. And then in the motor side, we spent most of our time here last semester, and we hadn't covered this yet. So that's where we're at. So we're covering the autonomic nervous system to talk about both the SNS and PNS. Okay, so let's look at a few key factors here that we see that are looking at the differences between the somatic nervous system over here on the side, and then the autonomic nervous system, and then specifically sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right, so first of all, in the somatic, it's a single neuron from the CNS to effector organ. It's just one neuron, right, all the way to the effector organ. In the autonomic, it's always a two-neuron chain. All right, so we got one here, its synapses here, and then we got another one here. Right, we see that both with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, except for one caveat, which is right here on the sympathetic side, where the preganglionic neuron goes to the adrenal medulla, and then that adrenal medulla releases chemicals into the blood, and then that serves as the postganglionic neuron. Okay, but we've got pre- and postganglionic neuron on the parasympathetic as well, right here, synapse, right here, and then target tissue. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one is the fact that myelination is very different. Somatic is large axon, heavily myelinated, so this is a very fast signal. Okay, when we look at the parasympathetic and sympathetic, we have lightly myelinated axon for the preganglionic ones, and then non-myelinated for postganglionic. So much slower signal for both this one and this one. Okay, and then we have differences in neurotransmitters. It's always going to be acetylcholine at the end of a somatic neuron. In the sympathetic nervous system, it's almost always going to be norepinephrine. At the end of parasympathetic, it's always going to be acetylcholine. And then we also have this in the ganglion where the pre and post ganglionic neuron interact. We have acetylcholine on the sympathetic side as well as acetylcholine on the parasympathetic side. Okay, another major difference is the target tissues, of course. Skeletal muscle on the somatic, smooth muscle, glands, and cardiac muscle on the autonomic. The effects, always stimulatory on the somatic side, sometimes stimulatory, sometimes inhibitory on the autonomic side. Okay, let's look some more definitions here. We have two different types, main types of receptors, two categories of receptors at least. We have cholinergic receptors and adrenergic receptors. These are both named by what those receptors respond to. Okay, so cholinergic responds to acetylcholine, right? So we got the choline part here. The whole choline word is also found right here, right? Choline. Okay, so the cholinergic receptors respond to acetylcholine. Okay, but then underneath those cholinergic receptors, there's two types. There's nicotinic and there's muscarinic. The nicotinic ones were found to be stimulated by nicotine, same stuff we find in tobacco. Okay, muscarinic ones were found to be stimulated by the same thing we find in poisonous mushrooms, a chemical called muscarine. That's where it gets the muscarinic name. Okay, we find the nicotinic ones in the neuromuscular junctions. That's more of the somatic part, right? We also find it in the ganglions of the autonomic nervous system. So between the pre-ganglionic neurons, when those synapse with the post-ganglionic neurons, that's where we're going to find nicotinic receptors. And then the muscarinic receptors are found at the target tissues of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, on the adrenergic side, another receptor named after what it responds to. Okay, so always going to be these adrenergic receptors respond to norepinephrine and epinephrine. The other name for epinephrine is adrenaline. Okay, again, we've got adren. Okay, we'll come back over here. We've got adren. Okay, adrenergic receptors respond to adrenaline, which is the same thing as epinephrine, but they also respond to norepinephrine. Okay, these are found on target tissues of the sympathetic nervous system. There's a bunch of different classes. There's BIO140 there's alpha 1 and 2. You're not going to need to know the differences between those for this class, but just know when you see beta adrenergic, alpha adrenergic, that's just referring to a receptor for the sympathetic nervous system, norepinephrine and epinephrine. All right, the control of the autonomic nervous system. We have some subconscious communication between our frontal lobe and our limbic system for emotional input, some communication back and forth from there, and then also back and forth from the hypothalamus. Okay, so it's those interactions that helps integrate input from other parts of the brain. Okay, and then that hypothalamus is really in control of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to send signals to the brainstem for some of these functions here, and it's also going to send signals down to the spinal cord for some of the reflexive functions. Okay, so autonomic nervous system anatomy. Okay, so what is a ganglion? Right? A ganglion, as we've talked about before already, is a cluster of synapses between cell bodies and axons. Okay, so really the way this works is we have one neuron here. Okay, this is the cell body, all of its little dendrites. Okay, and then we're going to have another neuron here, all of its little dendrites. Okay, it's going to have an axon coming down here to the target tissue. Okay, the axon's coming down, target tissue's here. It's going to connect to that target tissue. Okay, this axon from this one comes down, also connects to the neuron. Okay, so this is our preganglionic neuron. This is a postganglionic neuron. Okay, and then we have this region right in here is the ganglion. Okay, it's that region where the preganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so a couple other things about why it's named parasympathetic. That literally means alongside. So it's because it comes from the brainstem and the sacral nerves, the top and the bottom of the central nervous system, whereas the sympathetic comes from the middle, the thoracic and lumbar nerves. Okay, so both of them have these two neurons set up, preganglionic neuron to postganglionic neuron, just like we just talked about. And so the cell bodies for the preganglionic neurons are found in the spinal cord. Cell bodies for those postganglionic neurons are found in the autonomic ganglia. All right, that's what this looks like here. So we got parasympathetic on this side in purple. You can see it just coming from the top and the bottom, right? So it's alongside, whereas the sympathetic comes from this region in the middle. Okay, so that answers the locations one. Length of the postganglionic neurons. What we'll see here is the ganglions here on this purple side are right here, right? Here's our ganglions, right? And they're right next to the target tissue. Okay, so what that means is these postganglionic neurons are very short. So SNS is short. Sorry, PNS is short. PNS is short. SNS, let's look at that. We have the ganglions right here, okay, but then we have this long postganglionic neuron. Okay, so those ones are long. Okay, length of the preganglionic neurons. Now we have long ones on the sympathetic side. On the parasympathetic side, they're very short, right? It's just these little guys. Okay, so PNS equals long, SNS equals short. So what does that mean for us practically? What it means is the PNS has very specific and targeted effects, okay, just on one one tissue. This is just acting there, whereas the SNS has more diffuse effects. Because what happens with that long postganglionic neuron is it's able to move, right? It can spread out, it can branch, it can move all over the place, and that gives it more diffuse effects. All right, so another little table to kind of break this down. Spinal cord region, we just talked about this. Sympathetic is thoracic and lumbar. Parasympathetic is cranial and sacral. General effects, we know that. Length of effect, long-lasting due to hormones. Okay, those hormones have to break down via their half-life. So those effects of the SNS last longer because of that. Okay, and these are short-lived. We'll talk about what these hormones are, but this is really the neuroendocrine side. Okay, specificity of effect. Sympathetic has very diffuse effects because of two reasons. The branching in that long postganglionic neuron we just talked about, and the fact that there's hormones via this neuroendocrine portion. Parasympathetic, very specific effects. We just said this, long postganglionic neuron and short here. Okay, so the general pathway in the parasympathetic looks like this. We have a long preganglionic neuron that goes almost all the way to the target. It's always going to release ACH here, okay? So that makes it a cholinergic receptor, right? And that binds to a, not just a cholinergic, but a nicotinic cholinergic, right? Those two go together on the postganglionic neuron. And then the short postganglionic neuron, right? Very short, very near the target, releases again acetylcholine, but this time into a muscarinic receptor, so it's a cholinergic muscarinic receptor. Okay, so it's always going to be the pathway parasympathetic. Okay, all right. Now some specific effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. We can see these here. Effects on the eye via the oculomotor nerve. Okay, dealing with the iris, the ciliary body. Call this not just bulging, but making it more convex. Right. One key clinical application here is a drug called atropine, which the optometrist puts in your eye when they want your eye to dilate. Right. This causes pupil dilation. Causes this because it blocks the muscarinic cholinergic receptors in the iris. So if we're blocking muscarinic receptors, let's go back and see which one that would affect on the previous slide. So not the ganglionic interaction, but the postganglionic neuron to the target tissue. That's the muscarinic one. So that's what we're blocking. Okay, so that makes sense. If we block that, if we block the thing that's supposed to constrict the pupil, it dilates instead. Okay, so the facial nerve stimulates the lacrimal gland, causes tears, stimulates the nasal gland for mucus, salivary glands for digestion. Cranial nerve 9 stimulates salivary glands again for more saliva. Okay, the vagus nerve, very broad influence. It's called the wanderer, distributes all over the body and the heart. Specifically, it decreases heart rate, it decreases strength of contraction. In the bronchioles, leading down to the bottom of our lungs and our airways, causes constriction of smooth muscle. Digestive organs, all those stomach, gallbladder, small intestines, pancreas, liver, the distal half of the large intestine, stimulates digestion and movement of food and secretion of digestive enzymes. Okay, and then we've got in the kidneys, stimulates increased urine production. Okay, so we've got all of these things happening that the vagus nerve are doing that are all things that can happen when we're not stressed, right? We're not stressed, we can digest food, we can have our heart rate can be lower, right? We can breathe less with the bronchioles, and we can digest food and we can urinate. Okay, so fill this in to kind of recap what we just talked about on those cranial nerves. And so this is just one half of the parasympathetic nervous system up here. So next we'll talk about the other side, the sacral nerve side of the parasympathetic. Okay, so the distal half of the large intestine is innervated by this. This helps us move waste through. Okay, and then this helps us relax our sphincter in our anus to defecate. Okay, also relaxes the sphincter between the kidneys and the ureter. Ureters are little tubes that take urine from the kidneys to the bladder, and then also allows for urination via contraction of the bladder that literally squeezes the urine out and contracts or relaxes the sphincter to allow the urine out. In the penis and the clitoris, in males and females respectively, increases blood flow, which results in erection. So we'll see in a sec that, interestingly, the parasympathetic controls erection, but the sympathetic controls ejaculation or orgasm. And orgasm. They're not the same thing. We'll get into that later. Okay, you can recap that here. Those last ones on the sacral nerves. All right, and then let's dive into the sympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system, again, has very diffuse effects, and that's due to multiple things. It's due to branching in the chain of ganglia. It's due to that shorter preganglionic neuron, and that which allows for a long postganglionic neuron. And then even more importantly, it's due to the hormones, really the neuroendocrine portion of this, which leads to long-lasting effects and very diffuse effects because it goes all over the body. Okay, so the pathway we find in the sympathetic nervous system, it's always a short preganglionic neuron. Each preganglionic neuron synapses with many postganglionic neurons instead of just one. So that's what helps it spread out too. And then that preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine, okay? And that's going to be a nicotinic receptor, so same exact thing as the parasympathetic so far. But then on the postganglionic neuron, it's going to release, it's going to travel all around, spread out a little bit. There's three possible options for what can happen. Number one, most commonly, is it releases norepinephrine into an adrenergic receptor. Okay. Another option in a few cases, we have acetylcholine into a muscarinic receptor. This would be the exact same as the PNS. Okay. And then the third option, which happens commonly with sympathetic activity, is the adrenal medulla substitutes for the postganglion. So we don't have a postganglionic neuron in this case, and that we just have a preganglionic neuron going to the medulla of the adrenal gland. It causes epinephrine and norepinephrine to release into the blood, and it's going to go all over the body and give us very diffuse effects. So just as a little reminder, where is that adrenal medulla? Well, remember the adrenal gland is on top of the kidneys, also known as the suprarenal. All right, it's on top of the kidneys, and if kind of like this kind of a structure, that's not really that a good look at it, but I tried. There's an outer part called the cortex, okay, and then there's an inner part called the medulla. All right, and that's the adrenal gland. So the medulla is that inner part, and it's made up of neurons, not of endocrine glands. And this is that, again, this is that neuroendocrine portion of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so some actions of the sympathetic nervous system. Targets and actions here. Ciliary muscle, sorry about that. Ciliary muscle relaxation, going to cause the lens to flatten out. Iris relaxation, pupil size increases. Nasal gland reduces mucus production. You can see the salivary gland stimulates thick saliva instead of thin. Increases heart rate and strength of contraction. Bronchioles causes dilation. Right? Makes sense when we're stressed out. Heart rate's got to go up. We got to be able to breathe more. Okay. We don't want to waste a bunch of fluid, so we reduce mucus production, and we make thick saliva instead of thin, so less water loss when we're under stress. Okay, some important clinical applications. Some of you are probably on a cold medicine right now, like Tylenol, cold and flu, Sudafed, something like that, and Dayquil, something like that. Most of those all either have pseudoephedrine in them or they have phenylephrine in them. Both of those act in the same way. They act on alpha-1 adrenergic receptors, right? So adrenergic, it's going to be for norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? It's an agonist. That means it does the same thing that the normal chemical would do. And so that causes constriction of blood vessels in the nose. So we're limiting blood flow to the nose. What does that do? That reduces mucus production. So that helps with your decreases congestion, decreases your runny nose. Okay, another important one is beta blockers. A couple of names of them here: metoprolol, propranolol. These are very common blood pressure drugs. You'll see patients on these in the hospital, cardiac patients. What they do is they block the action of the sympathetic nervous system on those beta adrenergic blockers, beta adrenergic receptors, right? And adrenergic, right? So if they're adrenergic, they're blocking the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. What does the sympathetic nervous system do to blood vessels? SNS causes constriction of vessels. So if we block that constriction effect, we actually get dilation instead, and that decreases blood pressure. Okay, lastly on this side, albuterol is a common asthma drug. All right, when you start having I didn't spell that right. Sorry, I'm just going to leave it. Just need an H, I think. There we go. When you start having an asthma attack, your airways start constricting. So the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the airways are to dilate them. So we have a beta adrenergic agonist. So we want to do more of what the sympathetic nervous system does. So this stimulates dilation, so we can breathe more. Okay, you can recap those there. The only two I didn't talk about were the sweat glands. And so just as you can imagine, stress leads to sweat. So increase in sweat rate with SNS. Erector pili muscles, if you guys remember these make your hair stand up. All right, these give you the goosebumps. These are activated with stress, so increase activation with stress and SNS. Everything else we talked about, so you can go ahead and fill those in. Okay, sympathetic here. The other portions, effects of it on the abdomen and pelvis. So again, that adrenal gland releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into blood has effects all over the body. Okay, we affect the liver. The liver will release glucose into the blood. Okay? If we're stressed out, we want glucose available to use for energy. Okay, the pancreas is going to be inhibited to release insulin, so it doesn't release insulin because insulin will cause blood sugar to go down. We want blood sugar to stay up. So we don't want the insulin to be increased to drop blood sugar, because we want it available for our brain mostly, but all over the place as well. So large intestine, we inhibit contraction of the large intestine and stimulate anal sphincter contraction. This one directly stops defecation, and both of them stop defecation. It stops moving feces through the large intestine and blocks it by contracting the sphincter. Bladder, we contract the sphincter and inhibit smooth muscle. So that stops urination. Contract sphincter, blocks the way, inhibits smooth muscle, doesn't push the urine down. Again, this leads to orgasm in both sexes and ejaculation in males. Okay, and this is kind of recapping the effects on the sympathetic nervous system and the abdomen and pelvis. You can go ahead and fill that in, and that'll do it, guys. So study hard and know the stuff well, and we'll see you on Monday.